Welcome, everyone. U.S. President Donald Trump calls it his one big, beautiful tax and spending package. And after some intense political wrangling, he signed it into law on Friday, legislation that will bring sweeping changes to Americans' finances. The multi-trillion-dollar domestic policy bill makes permanent Donald Trump's 2017 tax cuts while adding a bigger state and local tax deduction. It will also enact deep spending cuts to social safety net programs such as Medicaid and food stamp benefits and tax credits tied to clean energy and overhaul federal student loans. And Trump's legislation could benefit higher earners while hurting the lowest income Americans. And oh yeah, it's going to also add a few $1 trillion to U.S. national debt. This controversial bill is the focus of your Spotlight program. But first, here's a quick package by Ramin Mazaheri.
On the nation's Independence Day holiday, major protests were held around the country against President Donald Trump under the banner of Free America. The organizers chose the slogan in order to free America from the grip of the nation's oligarchs, from the mass layoffs of government workers, and from the flood of executive orders, which increasingly appears to be how Europe and the United States manage their democracies.
Free from not following the Constitution. So right now, our country was founded on the separation of powers, and the Congress is supposed to have powers of war and budget, and not the presidency. And so basically what I want is us to start following the Constitution again and free from oligarchs buying an election like Elon Musk.
On the holiday, Trump signed his controversial $5 trillion tax cut mega bill into law, dubbed his Big Beautiful Bill. In exchange for significant austerity cuts to social services, reduced food aid for the poor, and the loss of medical insurance for nearly 20 million people, the bill increases war spending and drastically cuts taxes for the wealthy.
The University of Pennsylvania has recently shown that the effects of the budget, the reconciliation package, is going to redistribute wealth from the bottom 60% of the American population up towards the top 1% of the population. So I don't think that's a good policy. I think it's going to adversely affect the people that need a break in this society. So
many protesters demanded that Trump learn from his failed strikes on Iran's nuclear energy program and cease fomenting war with Israel in the region.
I don't think he ever should have gotten started with this. I mean, I don't want to be supporting Israel, a genocidal regime, and Israel strikes into Iran, and then Trump followed suit. It's ridiculous. We don't need to be dragging ourselves into a war in Iran. We just got out of the Middle East in a lot of places. So
Trump's approval rating has dropped to 40%, reflecting a drop of 10 percentage points over the last 3 months, with high-profile immigration raids and the failed war against Iran often cited as the primary drivers.
The White House boasted that the Big Beautiful Bill's more than $1 trillion in assistance cuts makes it the largest spending reduction to the nation's social safety net in history. Ramin Mazaheri, Press TV, Washington, D.C.
And now for your guests. Joining us is George Samueli, Senior Research Fellow from London Metropolitan University, joining us from Budapest, Hungary. And Mr. Daniel Kovalik, author and lawyer, joining us out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, out of the States. Hello, gentlemen. A pleasure to have you both join us on our program. I guess we'll start there in the U.S. with you, Daniel. Thanks for joining us on the program. Now, many see this bill, Daniel, as the biggest and most cataclysmic overhaul and shock to America's and Americans' finances. They say that Donald Trump's bill will raise top-tier wealth, erode health care, and many other programs for the poor, and raise the deficit by over $3 trillion. Your initial thoughts, what all this controversy is surrounding this bill, Daniel?
Yes, well, I agree. It's an unmitigated disaster for the American people. In fact, there were, I believe, 25 U.S. Catholic bishops that wrote a letter condemning the bill as being one that is an attack on the poor, one that increases military spending, increases spending on ICE, the very repressive immigration forces. In fact, ICE will receive more money many countries' entire military budgets. This is the mean season. I mean, this is an attack on the poor, on working people, on public health. In fact, the Medicaid that's being cut will not only hurt the poor, many hospitals will shut down because of this, because a lot of the hospitals depend on that Medicaid money, particularly in rural areas, small towns, just to survive. So this is a terrible thing.
Thank you there, Daniel. And George, Sam, Muley, thank you for your patience and welcome to the program there. Now, George, your take on where you have arrived after studying the bill and hearing different aspects of it as well, good or bad for America, because it does have some good aspects of it as well, obviously, to attract many people voting for it. And which Americans do you think are going to benefit and which is it going to be really bad for?
Well, I think as you properly characterize it, it's a mixed bag. Yes, there are indeed tax cuts for the rich, but it's essentially an extension of the 2017 tax code, making them permanent. But there are also tax breaks for the not so rich. I mean, the signature Trump promises no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on Social Security. There are also tax deductions for the elderly, tax deductions for the poorer the sections of the society. Now, the Medicaid that my colleague mentioned, that's absolutely right. I think that is going to be quite a serious problem. The Medicaid cuts, it'll affect hospitals, but it also will affect individual beneficiaries of Medicaid who will now have to prove, they'll have to present paperwork to prove that they are able-bodied and that they're working. So the aspect of it, I think that will be quite problematic, but we don't yet know the full extent of it because we're just juggling around with the numbers, is that it will obviously have an impact in increasing the deficit. However, Trump and his supporters will argue that, well, the government will be bringing in a lot of revenue from tariffs. It will be. Whether the revenue from tariffs will offset the growth in the deficit, that remains to be seen.
Thank you. And I want to get back to what you just alluded to, George, for my next question to Daniel. During Trump's, first term, a Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, or the TCJA, it enacted sweeping changes to U.S. tax code and lowered taxes for many households. Some of the key provisions, it says, included lower tax brackets, bigger standard deductions, a more generous child tax credit, a higher estate and gift tax exemption, and 20% deduction for pass-through businesses, among other measures. Now, this TCJS was supposed to expire this year if there wasn't some kind of permanent fix or legislation passed to keep it in effect. So here we are at this big, beautiful so-called policy that Trump has. So why so much opposition? Because a lot of these things, they seem like they benefit the voter. But I should also make it, it's also remarkable for many of the Americans that voted Donald Trump, and that is into office, and that is the group, the tax bracket, that is your rural working class Americans. They're the ones that are worst impacted by this bill.
Yes, well, that's exactly right. Again, this hurts poor people the most. While there is some tax relief, as you say, for lower income people, they don't pay that much tax to begin with, right? I mean, it doesn't amount to a lot of money. The social cuts are going to be outweigh more than outweigh the relief for the taxes, right? A lot of us would be willing to pay more taxes for more social benefits, and there's some hidden cuts in there too. For example, Medicare, which is insurance for the elderly, for seniors, which people like my parents depend on. While it doesn't explicitly say those will be cut, those are things that will be marked for reduction if the budget is not balanced, right? In the end, the budget will be balanced on the backs of elderly people by cutting Medicare. And it is true that there is some relief in terms of paying taxes on Social Security, but a lot of people fear that that's the next social benefit to be cut, is Social Security. So, and the more we go into debt, and again, we're going into debt, let's be very clear, on the military, on ICE, which is a quasi-military group, and on tax cuts for the rich. That's where most of these monies are going. When you go into debt, all that's going to do is make providing these social programs and infrastructure programs more difficult in the future. In fact, it will guarantee that.
And when we think about how this was dressed up, George, to get through, we mentioned some of the things that are attractive about it, but we also mentioned Medicaid and Medicare, to Daniel's point. Now, Medicaid alone provides health coverage to over 71 million Americans. This is something both Republicans and Democrats, and Republicans, yeah, they wanted some amendments to the initial bill, but they didn't want to see it basically outright stripped because they knew that it benefits many of their constituencies as well. So how the heck is this getting through when you're cutting health care and possibly more periphery protection to over 100 million Americans?
Well, that was a matter of some controversy among the Republican senators. So somebody like Senator Josh Hawley, who's a Republican from the state of Missouri, was very strongly opposed to these cuts to Medicaid because he says, well, my constituents and people who are supporters of President Trump will be hurt by cuts to Medicaid. And that, I think, is unquestionably the case. And one has to say that Trump may have certainly made a serious political strategic mistake in going down this path, because if one thinks about some of his MAGA supporters, particularly somebody like Steve Bannon, who's a kind of a political strategist, a sort of the big thinker with MAGA, he didn't really think that Trump should embrace the cause of tax cuts for the wealthy. There's no reason for it. The economy is doing pretty well. So the only reason to have tax cuts is if the economy is in a recession and you need to stimulate the economy. So that which is what Ronald Reagan famously did, and Republicans have been repeating the mantra from Ronald Reagan for more than 40 years. So given that there was no real urgency to maintain these tax cuts, so somebody like Steve Bannon said, well, look, we do have a deficit problem, and why not raise taxes on the rich, particularly when these people, these very, very wealthy, the hedge fund billionaires and so on, are not supporters of Trump. Trump supporters are the poorer sections of America. The very, very wealthy vote for the Democrats. So the political strategists such as Steve Bannon or somebody like Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri say, what do you owe the wealthy? They don't support you. They support the Democrats. So raise taxes on them and maintain the social programs that benefit your supporters.
And Daniel, the legislation cuts, while we're still on Medicaid, over $1 trillion from Medicaid, if you can even imagine that kind of cut. That's according to Congressional Budget Office estimates. And many people, you've heard this before, and you've heard this quite a few times, Daniel, that it's too rich a country, the U.S., to turn its back on its weak and sick. No other nation with this kind of economic capacity does this.
No, absolutely. You know, I live in the inner city in Pittsburgh, and I see the suffering of people. I see the homeless. I see people who are barely eking out a living, even when they work. You know, most people who work still don't have health insurance. And you can't get health insurance just because you work. It's up to the employer, right? And if you have a low-paying job, they generally don't give you any benefits at all. So, again, the people who are going to suffer from this are the working poor. We have many of them. We have the worst health outcomes in the industrialized world, right? We have the worst infrastructure in the industrialized world, bridges that are falling down, highways collapsing. Why isn't there money going to this? Why does China have all these speed trains and the United States has none? It's a disgrace, really. And again, the fact that Trump is bragging that this is the biggest cut to social programs in history, that's nothing to brag about.
No, it isn't, is it? And George, food stamp cuts, they may ultimately affect more than 40 million people, George, and that's according to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. That includes about 16 million children, 8 million seniors, 4 million non-elderly adults with disabilities, among others. Now, I remember someone once told me what separates us from animals is that in their kingdom, they abandon the weak. In ours, we protect our weak, George.
Right. No, that is that's certainly the case. However, I think the Medicaid will continue to be provided for the working poor. I mean, I think that that's not really the issue. The issue with the Medicaid was if you're not working, I think then that's going to be a real problem. But there are all sorts of reasons why somebody may not be working, and therefore and not getting Medicaid. But if you are working, then you would still continue to receive Medicaid. No, I think there's no question that the social programs in the United States are a lot weaker and flimsier than they need to be, and I think that's and that was really in some ways part of the movement that gave rise to Donald Trump, which is, hey, we're spending huge amounts on the military, we're spending huge amounts on foreign interventionism, and we're doing it to support and prop up the militaries of countries where the citizens enjoy a much higher standard of life. And then they say, well, that doesn't really make much sense, where in Western Europe, and in fact in Europe as a whole, people enjoy a very good level of healthcare, far better level of healthcare than most Americans enjoy. But they can do that because they don't have to spend anything on their military, because the United States essentially provides them with a blank check. And it's part of the movement of Trumpism. It's the movement of MAGA, Make America Great Again, and Make America First. It says, hey, why are we propping up countries whose health and welfare system is far superior to that of the United States? Unfortunately, Trump has yet to make good on the promises that he had once made.
And Daniel, you want to speak on the food stamp cuts and how that may impact people, and also, if you could, on the student loan, the way that's kind of worded, it's very deceptive. While it expands, this legislation expands access to Pell Grants. Now, Pell Grants, they only give you a few $100, you very well know. I mean, I used them in the early 90s in Santa Barbara. I think I was $300 or $400 a term was what I got through my Pell Grants. But in the back end, what it does, it limits much more how much money people can borrow from the federal government in loans to pay for their education. So while, okay, access to Pell Grants may be completely expanded, great. There's about $300-400 a month, and now more people have access to that. But people who need the $20,000-30,000 to get their bachelor's or much more for their master's or more, well, they're going to hit a lot of obstacles and roadblocks from here on in.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you're going to have many less people going to college, I think, because, I mean, that 30,000 you're saying, that's per year, right? Exactly. In a lot of institutions, or much more. So, we're moving back to the turn of the century, and I mean the turn of the, 19th and 20th century, where only the rich will go to school. And as you say, with food stamps, we already have malnutrition in this country, and bad nutrition for people. This is only going to increase that problem. And again, it's completely preventable. The amount of money they're going to save from those programs is minimal. compared to, again, the tax cuts they're doling out to the rich, to the military programs they're paying for. It shows a priority system that is not based in the people. It's really disregards human needs.
And George, Chuck Schumer, the Democrats, he says this sweeping legislation is betraying U.S. Citizens. Now, if you agree or disagree with that, the funny thing is, in general here, George, that for years it was the Democrats who, with their social spending plans and policies, they would add to the U.S. national debt, to the vehement opposition of the Republicans, who always push back against any policy that would even add a cent to U.S. national debt. And here's a Trump bill that's going to add over $3.3 trillion to U.S. national debt, and they're supporting it. I mean, many say that Republicans just a few years ago would have found this sacrilege. So how much control does this mean Trump has over the GOP parties and America's future?
Well, this is the thing, and what I was talking about a moment ago, which is that the Republican Party, ever since Ronald Reagan, has made it its absolute creed that taxes must be cut, irrespective of whether there's any real need for it. As I said, it only makes sense to cut taxes when when you're in the middle of a recession and you need to stimulate the economy. But otherwise, you need your tax revenue in order to pay for your spending programs. But instead, every single Republican president since the days of Reagan has been committed to cutting taxes. And so in this case, with Trump, he did that in 2017. Again, the economy wasn't really doing badly, but nonetheless, he went ahead with that, with this tax cut, and he's doing it now. And again, the economy is doing pretty well. The job numbers are pretty good, the inflation numbers are pretty good. There's no need for a tax cut, particularly when you look at all of the Congressional Budget Office numbers and pretty much every set of numbers, that this will add to the deficit. And so you're absolutely right. It used to be the case where Republicans were committed to reducing budget deficits, but now they just seem to say, well, that doesn't really matter. We'll just kick the can down the road. Well, you can't keep kicking the can down the road because, of course, you do have to pay the debt. I mean, you can't get around it. There is a debt to pay. You've got to do it, and you've got to make sure that the bondholders are kept happy. And if the bondholders are not happy, then the interest rates rise, and that adds to the deficit. But that's become the Republican creed, and Trump could have done something about it. Trump was hinting during these negotiations during the past few months that he's open to the idea of raising taxes, but he dropped the idea because he wanted to maintain his standing among Republicans who are all wedded to the idea of tax cuts.
All right, we have less than, thank you, George. We have less than a minute left. Daniel, your final thoughts on, are you surprised this many Republicans back Trump's play on this?
No, I'm not surprised at all. I mean, if you actually look back, going back to Reagan, while the Republicans talk a good game about wanting to balance the budget, it tends to be under their administrations that the deficit actually increases, right? Because they've been willing to do it on tax cuts for the rich and for the war machine. And so this is nothing but a continuation of that policy.
And thank you both for joining us on the program. Stay safe to the both of you. Daniel Kovalik there joining us out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and George Samueli joining us from Budapest, Hungary. And viewers, this brings us to the end of your Press TV Spotlight program. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye for now.